It'll take hang on, excuse me. It'll take 2 goes, probably, maybe 3. Making me look at myself now. Okay. So the subject of the presentation is the title I gave it to when I first did it a couple of years ago was The Bible, the British, and the Abolition of the West African Slave Trade. And I can't remember how I first came out. I think I read a particular fact, which I thought was an amazing thing. This thing that I read, and it got me interested in the subject of abolition. I knew next to nothing about it, and it's also a sensitive subject. Racial things are sensitive, and so I was mindful for a while just to kind of, shall I do it or shan't I do it? And there's a couple of things. One thing with sensitive subjects is be clear. Because if you're sensitive, then nobody can tell what you're saying. You know what I mean? And so be clear. And not that there's anything bad in what I'm going to put forward. And I'm going to deal with something that's actually a very, very good story. And the other thing then was how would it play across people that haven't got the same background as me? And so I asked a number of people at camps. I told them what I'd found out. African people or of African descent or West Indian descent, which is kind of African descent as well. And I asked them what they thought when I told them a couple of things, and they were all very interested, very, very interested. And I said to one sister locally, I said, if I presented this, would you be nervous? She said, no, I'd be interested. So that was it. That was me green light. And so I've got. I'm going to tell you the story. Let's go screen share. Right, so hopefully you can see that. I'll go from the beginning. You can see that picture? Yeah, okay. So I first did it a couple of years ago when we can we get rid of that? Sorry, it's typing out what I speak, the computer. So we did this a couple of years ago. We went away for a weekend, and we hired a village hall, and I put it on at the village hall, and we put out flyers in the village, thinking it might be something that people were interested in. One lady came on the Sunday, but not on the Saturday when we did the presentation. But nevertheless, so Anthony and Rachel were there that weekend. So yeah, that's how we knew about it. All right, so there's 5 particular parts. I'll try and get into the third part today. Do the first 2 and get into the third part. There's the argument. It might seem strange to us, but for a long time there was an argument over whether slavery was biblical or not. Okay, whether it was biblical or not. Now, as I say, to us it seems quite simple, but then there was theological arguments for it and against it. So we're going to have a little look at that. The movement, the abolition movement, particularly in Britain. It was in Britain and America, particularly in Britain. This force that came up among people, where it came from the Bible, how it worked, how they built up this movement, this abolition movement. 1801 and all that, which is talking about how all of a sudden Britain became an enormously powerful nation, which it hadn't been before. And then we're going to look at the abolition of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. It's 2 different things at 2 different times. The abolition of the slave trade was an endeavour to stop people trading in men, slaves, and then the other thing was a lot of people were already slaves. What about them? And that came later. And I suppose just one little thing before we get into the slides is it really is. I heard somewhere somebody say that it's the greatest humanitarian act that the world has ever known. Abolition. That's not quite right. That's not quite right because we all know of one greater. But nevertheless, it's a remarkable thing that took place from the British Isles around the world, in particularly the 1800s. And it is a thing. Say tomorrow, the Prime Minister of Ireland, the Taoiseach, He's called the Taoiseach. Michael Martin, is it now? I'm not sure who it is now. I think it might be Michael Martin. Say tomorrow he decided, and the Parliament of Ireland decided to rid the world of the drugs trade. You know, that would be a good thing. But do you think he'd succeed? Do you think he wouldn't? So just one of the most remarkable things about this story is that the people that wanted to did. It's amazing. Anyway, he's my mate. He was standing outside the Parliament all through the Brexit negotiations. I've got a photo of me and him. I just like the photo. So I like the fella as well. Actually, I got talking to him. We were talking about lions, but that's another story. So a brief history and definition of slave trading. So when we talk about the slave trade, we will most of us will think about African slavery in the 16, 17, and 1800s. People coming from Africa, packed in ships, going to America, South America, Brazil, Cuba, that type of thing, and the West Indies. But slavery is as old as the hills. And here's a little map of slave movements, if you like. In the red line, it's the Barbary slave trade. 1.25 million people were enslaved and taken to North Africa by Muslims or Mohammedans, including from Britain and Ireland, by the way. There was lots of white slaves. And then you've got the other two, the Ottoman slave trade. That was a different side of the Mohammedan world. And other things. The word slave comes from Slavs, which is Eastern European people. Certain Eastern European people are called Slavic, and they have Slavic languages. And there was so many of them that's where the word slave came from. This is what we think of. It's the West African slave trade. So you can see along the coast of Africa there, West Africa, Angola, just not that far above South Africa as it is now. Up that side. The south of Sierra Leone is where Nigeria is now, and Ghana, and people were taken from there, particularly by the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch, the French, to Brazil, as I was saying before, Brazil, North America, and Central America, and the West Indies. And I suppose the difference between that trade and the slave trades that had gone before and way before was how many people were involved. Because now they'd gotten good at it. Now they had ships. Now they could cross oceans. And now they had great plantations in this vast new world that had been discovered, particularly in North America. So the numbers increased, but it was nothing new. So the argument is slavery in the Bible. Well, the answer is yes. The answer is clearly yes. People were bought and sold in the Old Testament, and there were laws about it too in the Bible. So this is one that the slavers would use in his theological argument. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that belongs to thy neighbour. It's one of the 10 Commandments. So here it's saying, their argument was people had people. People owned people. Manservants and maidservants were people that were owned. And that's actually right. That's true. For the most part, that was true. It's not like a servant in the 1800s in upstairs, downstairs, and Hudson the butler. These people were owned. So the argument was it was in the Bible, and therefore it was legitimate. And but I was listening to one of the pastors in our morning thing, and he was talking about 1 Corinthians 14. He was talking about theology and logic. That you can go very wrong with theology, but what breaks down wrong theology is just good logic. And that's absolutely true. You know what I mean? So hopefully you'll see that come through as we go through this. So here's another Old Testament scripture. He that steals a man and sells him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. So it's not contradictory laws. You know, the Bible is a fountain that doesn't send forth sweet waters and bitter. You know, if you're saying one thing in one chapter, another a completely opposite thing in another chapter, how can anything be run on those terms? You know, you couldn't run a school on those terms. You couldn't run anything on those terms. So the fountain doesn't send forth sweet waters and bitter, and there is an understanding, and the understanding really is in this idea of stealing. Um, okay, so next one. So this is the New Testament, and Paul writing to Timothy, knowing this, that the law is not made for a righteous man, but for the lawless and the disobedient, and for sinners, for fornicators, for them that defile themselves with mankind, for enslavers or men stealers. It says I've copied out the wrong scripture. It says men stealers. So even in the New Testament, that type of slavery is condemned, and as I say in the Old Testament, it was condemned to death. So what we need to look at, because people had an argument, he picked one scripture against another. That's how controversy works, a controversy. But there is an understanding, and it's not that hard to grasp. But it was important in the day that those who handle the Bible, rightly dividing the word of truth, nailed their case. So the people that were hovering between two opinions would go to the right one, and they did. They really did. It says, if thou buy an Hebrew servant, 6 years shall he serve thee, and in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. If he came in by himself, he should go out by himself. If he were married, then his wife should go out with him. And here we get the idea of the limits of being owned by somebody else, which was possible. And there's a couple of things that you find consistent through many scriptures, and one of them is that you chose it. You chose it, so you're better off being owned by someone more or less for a period of time than being on your own and starving to death. Right? Between the two options, that was the best one, and it could and did happen. So there's two things. One of them is that you chose it, and the other one is that it was time limited. That was what was allowed. That you went into the contract, right, and you were owned by someone, and and there was a time limit on the contract. So this is a sweatshop in India, under all that pile of making shirts for Liverpool and Man U, and that's what they do. That's what happens. And sometimes this is called slave labour, right? But that's not the case. It's not the case. It's very hard labour, I'm sure, and very poorly paid, I'm sure. But if you took that away from them men or those boys, they would be worse off. That's not slavery. It's difficult. It's tough. But life is tough. You know, everybody's on the up, but life is tough. This is people in, I think it might be Vietnam, making all the trainers that everybody's after. And again, you know, sometimes you see it in the paper, and again, it's tough. But if you took this away from people, you wouldn't make the world a better place. This is not slavery. You know, this is something which is better than nothing for those involved. So, yeah, just some little quotations I come across when I was sifting through. Read me, yeah. So we're going back to Genesis. We're going to look at slavery in Genesis. As I say, slavery is as old as the hills. And you know, people know the story that Joseph was sold by his brothers, and that was you know, against that law in Exodus, stealing a man. And it says in the story, it says, "Let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and lay not our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." They pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. It's interesting, it's the Ishmaelites. We're going to look at the West African slave trade. But there was an East African one, which was Islamic. And one of the reasons that you don't hear so much about the East African slave trade is because when it was finished, there was nothing left. people were worked to death, and if there was any offspring, they weren't allowed to live. So there was nothing left at the end of it. But we're not going to go into that too much. This is a mug. You can buy this for 13 Canadian dollars. All right, if you're in Canada, some people are in Canada actually. So 13 Canadian dollars, and this is Joseph's report of what happened. He said, "For I indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews. Here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the dungeon." He was stolen. He knew he was stolen, and he knew it was stealing is a crime. And when it comes on top, as they say, and he said one to another, "We are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this distress had come upon us." And Reuben answered them, saying, "Spoke I not unto you, saying, do not sin against the child? And you would not hear." This is before the law, by the way. The law was given, but men have a law in their conscience, and sometimes theology, for want of a better expression, screws it up. Because there was a theology that said that slavery was a God's will almost, or God's allowance. It is not, and never was. Just a little bit more about Joseph's story. It says, when the year was ended, they came to him in the second year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord how our money is all spent in the herds of our livestock. Ah, my lord, there is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands." This is his brethren, and going back to Egypt. It says, "Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we will be servants to Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and die, and the land won't be desolate." So this is what was allowed, and again, this is before the law, and this is a good allowance. You either die, or you allow yourself to be bought, right? And they're quite distinct. One of them is benevolent and merciful and useful, and the other one is evil. The movement. Hang on, just talking about logic. I was reading about one guy, and he was in America, in the southern part of America. They had the slave trade in the northern part. They didn't, and he escaped to the northern part, and he ended up a very clever fella, actually, a black fella, and he says, "I've got to report a crime." He says, "This arm," he says, "I've stolen this arm because it belongs to somebody else, and this leg," he says, this must be a stolen leg because I've got it, and somebody else had bought it." And you think that makes it funny and very good. As I say, the logic of it above the theology. So the movement. So in Britain, particularly, say from 1750 onwards, there was this movement for abolition that they found it morally reprehensible that such a trade went on. By this time, it's taking hold, and Britain was heavily involved, quite good at it, really. Mostly, they would take slaves from Africa. The way it worked was a ship would go to Africa, pick up slaves, go to the Americas, and pick up goods, tobacco or coffee or something like that, cotton, and bring it back to England. So the goods would come back to England, but not many of the slaves came to England. Some of them went through the ports, but mainly the ships went from Africa to South America, Central America, the West Indies, and the United States of America. And then he picked up a cargo and brought it back to Britain, France, Belgium, Holland, not Belgium, didn't exist. So looking at the movement, and there's a number of names that are famous. If you'd ever look into it, William Wilberforce, quite an amazing fella. Granville Sharp, and some others, and they were called. They used to meet in a church in Clapham, and they were called the Clapham sect or the Saints. They were very much driven by a belief in God, a lively belief, whether he was spiritual. They were called the Saints by other people, by the way. They were called the Saints by other people. Wilberforce, he had some kind of conversion in his early 20s, and into the Methodist movement. The Methodists were very lively. They were, if you became a Methodist, he was from a well-to-do family, Wilberforce, and if you joined the Methodists, then a lot of your circle would cold shoulder you. Church of England was fine, but Methodists weren't fine to the powers that be, if you like, the established church. I don't know much about the established church, then it doesn't seem to be very impressive at all. They were totally silent and complicit, actually, with slavery, whereas the Methodists, in many ways, wanted to stir up the people with the gospel. As I say, we all sing Wesley songs, don't we? We sing Wesley hymns. Wesley was a Methodist, and it was a very powerful movement. Quite well organised as well, by the way. One thing I found out about Methodists is later on in the piece, in the later 1800s, they used to organise boys' clubs all around England, including one in Birmingham and one in Liverpool, that ended up as Aston Villa Football Club and Everton Football Club. They started by boys' clubs that the Methodists started. And I haven't really made head nor tail of all of them, but in the early part there was definitely some good there, without a doubt. Definitely some good there. And the other people that were heavily involved were the Quakers. And Quakers were, again, the difference between the Methodists and the Quakers, you'd find Methodists in Parliament, you wouldn't find Quakers. They wouldn't get involved in government, but they were involved in the movement, very much so. And, yeah. So what they would do is they would take knowledge, because there would be newspapers in those days, but there's no photographs. There's no, most people, if you lived in Birmingham, you never saw anything that happened in Liverpool, or so most of England hadn't seen anything. So they would take around petitions, they would take around chains, they would take around men that had been in the slave ships and tell everyone about it. In Liverpool, they used to get a very hard time. People would be beaten up, by people who were paid, by people who were making a fortune out of this trade. It was a very, very lucrative trade. That's not hard to imagine. Yeah, Granville Sharp was a particular character. He lived in London, and he did much good. He started. I'll tell you a little bit like what it was like in England at the time in a minute. But Granville Sharp used to walk around the docks in London, and one time he saw a black man, being forced onto a ship. He belonged to an American man from Boston. He was a slave. His name was James Somerset, very famous case, the James Somerset case. And he was owned by a man from Boston, but he ran away when he got to England, and he was recaptured, and he was on a ship to be taken to Jamaica. And Granville Sharp saw this. By the way, you will have seen in those days a lot of things that were wrong. It wasn't a civil society like our society, and this thing stood out. This thing did stand out, but there was lots of things wrong as well. And I think that's important to remember, the context of the times. And he said that's not right. And I think he taught himself law at Granville Sharp. I think that's the story with him. And he went to a judge and he said that man should not be being forced in our country. To be stolen. And there's a thing in law called habeas corpus, which means bring the man before the judge. His body's got to be there. Bring the man before the judge. It's to do with Magna Carta. So and he was granted habeas corpus on this James Somerset, a black man, an African man, a runaway slave, and he was brought to court. Now at that time, it wasn't really clear in law. It had never been tested in law whether slavery was legal in England. Right, the English were involved in the slave trade without a doubt. There were very few slaves in England, and if there were any, was that a legal thing or not? And what Granville Sharp wanted to do was to take it to court and to say it's not legal. So the case of James Somerset was in 1772, a very famous case in the movement of abolition. And he was up before the Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. And Lord Chief Justice Mansfield had to decide if this man could be forced, if he could be stolen, while he's on English soil, by the way, and sent force to go to Jamaica. And if he decided that he couldn't, then the economy of England would be in trouble. Because they built an economy based, or not based on, but certainly much fed by slavery. This is. I love this saying. It's a Latin saying. I put it in to make myself look clever. Okay, I can't even say it, but I love the saying. And apparently this is one of the things that Judge Mansfield said, although it didn't come from him originally. It existed before then, and it means, "Let justice be done, though the heavens fall." Right? Never mind the consequences financial. Never mind what other people think. Is it right or is it wrong? And I love that saying. In the scriptures, because these are people that will have known their Bible, by the way. England was Protestant. It says, "Lord, who shall abide in your tabernacle? Who shall dwell in your holy hill? He that walks uprightly and works righteously and speaks the truth in his heart, in whose eyes a vile person is condemned. He that honours them that fear the Lord, he that swears to his own hurt and changes not." Right? Blessed is that man. And that's what was going to happen. So basically, Lord Mansfield's finding was that in England, if you breathe our air, you are free. You cannot be a slave in England. You cannot be. He says, a man can be a villain, but he cannot be a slave. That was his finding, and it was the beginning of the shaking of the whole trade. One interesting thing with just to give you a bit of background, this is the 1780s now in England, and it's still quite a backward country in many ways, and not the foremost power in Europe by a long way, and for good reasons, right? But Lord Mansfield has an adopted daughter, I think it was, called Dido Bell. Now Dido Bell was an ex-slave. Her mother was a slave, and her father was a British officer over in Jamaica, and between them they had Dido Bell, and she came up and she grew up in Lord Mansfield's house as his daughter, as one of the family. You know, so the idea of showing you this is, I mean, it wasn't all like that. There were a number of black fellas or black people. It must have been mostly men in England, and most of them were in dire straits so far as money went and so far as life went. But so were a lot of people. It wasn't because they were black; it was just circumstantial. But some people did well circumstantially. Just to give it another major name in abolition in England is this fella. I can't say his first name. Equiano, and he was a slave, and he was freed. He got to London, and he wrote a book called "The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Oloda Equiano." I wish I could say his name. I'd like to say it properly. And there was 9 editions. People were interested in this business. And the reason I put them in, not everyone lived like that, wrote books and lived in fancy houses, but some did, and it gives you the context. Sometimes if you'd only hear one part of the story, which is very easy with these subjects, you like. I don't want to upset anyone if I mention Donald Trump. I know some people hate his guts. I don't, but he's like all of them. They come and go. God bless them. They come. God bless them. They go. There you go. But last week he pardoned 100 people. Did he? 130 people. And on its own, it sounds like, wow, what kind of fella's this going around giving pardons to his mates? Well, it's always been like that. I think Obama gave 300, something like that. And when I heard that, it gave a context to Trump. That's the point. There was lots of that around. So that it's important to know the context of what you're talking about. I did read through the things that people were in prison for that he pardoned, and some of them were spending 25 years for selling cannabis, man. So, goodness me, what a place. Anyway, another story that comes up in the 17, I think this is 17, I can't remember the year, 1780 something. It was a thing called the Zong Massacre. Again, this is to do with Granville Sharp. So what happens, there was a ship called the Zong, a slave ship, and it was taking slaves from West Africa to West Indies, I think. And like any merchantman, you would insure your cargo. You'd insure your cargo. And they had problems on the way with the ship. So they threw all the slaves off. They drowned them. They threw them off into the ocean. But when he came home, he claimed on the insurance. He tried to claim on the insurance, and our mate Granville Sharp was absolutely up in arms. Said, never mind insurance. He wanted them charged with murder. That's what he wanted. And again, it became this test case. It became a test case. And eventually, they weren't charged with murder, but they weren't able to claim on the insurance. Now you might think that that's nowhere near good enough, and you'd be right. But it was something and not nothing, and that was good. Right? Yeah. These are famous stories. So again, in England, there was a pottery company called Wedgwood. If people around the world heard of Wedgwood, very famous pot, like Waterford Crystal. It's the best. And on their pottery, lots of these big companies, by the way, successful companies, were Quakers. The Quakers were very good, very, very good tradesmen. Quite expensive, but trusted. And Wedgwood made quality, but in the so we would make plates and dishes and things made of porcelain and pottery stuff, and they would put forward abolitionist propaganda. And this is one of the famous ones. A man in chains looking up saying, am I not a man and a brother? And it's putting a question to people's consciences. They know what they're doing. They were very good at it, mate. They were very good at it. Granville Sharp started a place called Granville Town, where, by this time now we're into the late 1700s. America had become independent, and some of the black fellas in America had fought for Britain. And after that, they couldn't stay there, so they come to Britain, and there were other freed slaves. And they go, what do you do with them? So Granville Sharp had this idea to make a society for them in Africa. Granville Town didn't really work, but eventually it became a place called Freetown. In I think it's in Sierra Leone now, and there's Freetown. There was Sierra Leone and Liberia, which were early places that were given by people to enable society for freed slaves. That not only would they be freed, but they would also have a place at home back on their own continent where they'd have protection. Yeah, here's another one. Here you go. Here's the ladies. Because the ladies and men would propagate in different ways, sending this stuff around England. The people who hadn't seen slave ships, they'd send around the shackles and have meetings in halls and just drumming up support. This is a cloth medallion that somebody had made. Hebrews 13, chapter in verse 3, it says, "Remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them, and them which suffer adversities, being yourselves also in the body." It's not quite accurate in a sense, but at the time, though, it was very powerful. So I quite like this version of it. Remember that the prisoners as if chained with them. People have heard of John Newton. He wrote Amazing Grace. Originally, he was a slave trader, and he had a good friend called William Cowper. He was a poet, particularly a poet, but he wrote hymns as well. And they lived in a place in Northampton called Olney. I think it's called Olney. They very much knew each other, and I'm going to show you a couple of things that William Cowper wrote. William Cowper suffered all his life from depression, but when he wasn't depressed, he was an abolitionist of the first order, really. And he wrote this: "We have no slaves at home, then why abroad? Slaves cannot breathe in England if their lungs receive our air. that moment they are free. They touch our country and their shackles fall. That's noble and bespeaks a nation proud and jealous of the blessing. Spread it then and let it circulate through every vein. So they had this drive to. They weren't just happy that it didn't happen in England. They had an ambition which was way beyond themselves. Which was the abolition of the slave trade around the world and slavery itself. William, when it comes in two sections, two parts. 1807, we're going to get onto that, not today particularly. Parliament voted eventually to abolish the slave trade, and then in 1832 to abolish slavery. William Sharp, Granville Sharp, he wanted the big one. He didn't want the little one. He wanted the abolition of slavery. He always had ambition, but they had to do it step by step. It had to be like that. Yeah. Here's another one by William. I'll tell you in a minute a thing that William Cowper wrote that everyone knows. He says, the Negro's complaint, this is called, fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skins may differ, but affection dwells in white and black the same. Slaves of gold whose sordid dealings tarnish all your bloated powers, prove that you have human feelings ere you boldly question us. And so there's lots of things like this on the. I'll give you the William Cowper poem that you'd all know. Hang on, let's find it. So this one you've all heard. It's not to do with the abolition movement, but I just like it. It says, God moves in mysterious waves, his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. And it goes on and on a little bit. I really like it. It's quite a good poem, actually. God does work in mysterious ways sometimes. And yeah. I had a little joke. Yeah. This is from the house in Olney, where it's a museum now to the fellow that wrote Amazing Grace, John Newton and William Cowper. So sometimes slaves were given part education or part of the Bible. This is a slave's Bible, so it has particular things like Exodus are cut off, they're cut out. You know what I mean? they take it out, and so it's. I suppose you'd say it's people being bothered by their conscience. And one thing I read about in the USA was when people tried to educate slaves, it didn't make them happier. It made them want freedom more. It made them want justice more. And so no, there's no compromise. It's just an interesting thing with Wilberforce, by the way. He was an amazing fella. He really was, and he was only young. And when he was the driving force in Parliament, and he had two ambitions in life. One was abolition, and the other one was what's called the reformation of manners. He started in England. He started a thing called the RSPCA, protection of animals, because in England at that time you would get dogs trained to fight bulldogs. Either the bull had ripped the dog to bits, or the dogs had ripped the bull to bits. And he said, we went round saying, he said to the English men, he said, when you do that, it makes you animals. You're animals when you do that. And they stopped. Apparently he was just a great orator, a heartfelt orator, and effective. Okay, nearly at the end, I'll introduce it. How long have I been going? 35, all right. I'll go through 1801 and all that. So here's the thing. In Parliament, they had a number of votes to abolish the slave trade. Right, I think they had about 20 votes. They always lost by a long way because MPs then were money spoke. But he kept going, Wilberforce, fighting for it, and the movement was there. And when they had the last vote, one MP stood up and he said, "I can give you 20 reasons why we shouldn't vote to abolish the slave trade." He said, "But I only need one." He said, "We can't." He said, "We can't. If we give up our portion of the slave trade, the French or the Dutch or the Portuguese will take it, but it won't stop the trade." And that's a powerful argument. But something has happened. That was in 1807, and eventually, when they had that vote, I think he won by a landslide. And it's a great story of what happened that day. He sat down and wept, and the whole house cheered him in a way that they weren't supposed to. He'd won. But what had happened in a few years before is interesting. 1801, you have to ask Anthony about this. Britain takes part in the Abrahamic covenant. I will make thee a nation and shall be called great. But it also had like Israel. I think you did 1917 the other week, did you? You did 1917, and that's the end of the 7 times punishment, isn't it? Yeah, that's right, isn't it? For Jews, that's the end of the 7 times punishment. 2,520 years. Manasseh's at the end of Manasseh's 7 times punishment is 1776. Right, 25 years later, it was the end of Ephraim's 7 times punishment, and that was 1801. And that was to do with Britain. Now, you might not know what I'm talking about there, so Anthony has to fill in the details in a different talk. But they're great. It's a great story. The whole thing's a great story, and this is a very good part of it. So, covenants of the Old Testament, there's Noah, which is to do with the weather. There'll always be seed time and harvest, summer and winter, while the bow's in the sky. Yeah, don't worry about Greta. Read your Bible, will you? The Abrahamic. I will bless you and make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. There's Moses in the Lord of Moses. There's David and the throne of David. And there's the new covenant, which we're part of. All of those covenants are still in force today. All of them. So we're particularly interested in the Abrahamic and the one to David, with the throne of David. So Abraham, I will make you a great nation. I will bless thee. I will make thy name great. You will be a blessing. Bless them that bless you, and curse him that curse you. In you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So the Lord has a plan that he'd use certain nations to be a blessing to others. Right? 1801 is when the United Kingdom comes into play. It's a known date if you Google it. It's when you get the Union Jack or the Union of Jacob. The Scots and the Irish and the English are now one, and the Welsh. They're one, and it becomes the Union of Great Britain. And that was 1801. And all of a sudden, things started to change. Right? I love this one. Joseph is a fruitful bough or branch, even a fruitful bough by a well. That's the word of God to my mind. His branches run over the wall, outside of his own vineyard. The archers have sorely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow bows in strength, that's to do with military. And the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. So just before we get to 1807, one of the most famous things in British history is the Battle of Trafalgar, when Britain defeated the Napoleonic powers, Lord Nelson and all that. And it's an interesting thing that was such an important thing. There's a different mentality in Britain than France. Still is. It's an interesting thing. The whole thing is interesting. The mentalities that go along with it. And after the Battle of Trafalgar, everybody knows that at the height of its empire, Britain ruled a quarter of the world's land and the population, which is way after this. But what often doesn't get said is it ruled nearly all of its seas because of this, right? And when we get onto the detail of the effective stopping of the West African slave trade, you had to rule the seas, or you couldn't do it. So by the time Wilberforce won, not when he started to try, by the time he won, all of a sudden, Britannia ruled the waves. And there he is up there on Nelson's column, a national hero. You see the black part down at the bottom? It shows the heroes of the Battle of Trafalgar. And he's just in the corner there. It depends which. If you have a look at one side, there's a young boy with a gun, just on the one side, and he's an African boy. There he is. Look, he's an African boy, and there was 400 freed slaves in Nelson's fleet. Not just on the Victory in the fleet. There was one guy on the Victory who was a Swedish lieutenant, and he also was a freed slave. Remember I showed you earlier on about the Islamic countries raiding Europe? He also was a freed slave, and he fought for Britain. You know, so in Psalm, we're nearly at the end for this evening. Psalm 89. It's interesting actually because Psalm 88 is to do with David's darkest hours. And Psalm 89 has got great detail about God's covenant with David, which includes the throne, which is part of the British story. And you know, what we were looking at was the end of a punishment and into a blessing. Well, that's kind of what I don't know whether Psalm 88 and Psalm 89 were written just after each other. I don't know that, but it is interesting. That's what I thought anyway. But one of them is verse 25. So it's to do with David and his offspring. I will set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. You're going to be blessed at sea. You know, when you look at British military history, the sea is very much something that we're at home on. One of the interesting things with the British when it came to seafaring was they weren't the first to be good sailors. The Dutch went before them, the Portuguese went before them, and were much better than them. But the British learned from them. So when we went to sea, to go to America was harder for us than the Portuguese because we had to go through the rougher part. So they became more skilled. The Dutch taught them science, which included sauerkraut, ways of avoiding scurvy, very important. They learned that from the Dutch. So they learned science and seafaring techniques. The early sailors in Britain in Elizabeth I's time were what you call privateers, pirates basically. And they used to go off the coast of South America and rob the Spanish of their gold. With Queen Elizabeth I's blessing, saying that's what God would want. So, but they learned these great skills, and they were you wouldn't mess with them on the sea, mate. You wouldn't mess with them. They were the best. Another thing as well is the way they treated the men. It became much better when it came to the Battle of Trafalgar. To make people fight harder or with more heart, everyone was insured. So if you lost a hand, you'd get money, big money. If you lost a leg, you'd get money. They'd look after you. If you lost something fighting for us, we'll look after you. And it made people. And the other thing was, if you conquered a ship, you could have that ship and sell it, and the whole crew would have an equal, maybe not an equal portion, but a portion in the sale of the ship. They actually took a couple at the Battle of Trafalgar and were towing them round to Cairo, I think it was. Can't remember where it was, to sell them, and they all sank in a storm. all these ships that they'd kind of taken. But anyway, I'll leave it there. So next time we're going to get on to 1807, and when Parliament decided to abolish the slave trade, and how they brought that about. And I tell you what, it's a great story, difficult at times, but a great story. So back to you, Anthony.